On today's episode,
When we have mothers who say, I am not going to take the life of my child, even though it would be an advantage for me by worldly standards. I'm not going to do it. Why? Because there is something higher that I stand for. And the same with people who say, I could make a lot more money doing all sorts of other things, being involved in other industries, but there's something a lot higher. Those are heroes, and a lot of times you just have to be content with admiring heroes who other people aren't going to share your appreciation for.
Welcome to the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. People today face many opportunities and struggles when it comes to issues of life and death, marriage and family, health and science. We're here to bring a fresh biblical perspective to these issues and more. Join us now for Life Challenges.
hi, and welcome back. I'm Krista Potratz, and I'm here today with Pastors Bob Fleischman and Jeff Samuelson. And today we're going to talk about heroes. We want to talk about heroes in the biblical context today, but also just how it relates to our life and then as well as life challenges and the pro-life topics that we cover too. And so just really wanted to start maybe on just defining what a hero is, maybe both just in our modern culture and maybe biblically as well too.
Well, first of all, in culture, a hero seems to rise to the surface as exemplifying everything we want for that. That's why, for example, in the pro-life movement, I remember the first time, and I don't remember what year that was, but there was the shooting of an abortionist. And there were some who called him a hero for having done that, and others, and myself included, deplored it, But so sometimes it has to do ideologically where you're positioned. But heroes really are just exemplify kind of a high ideal in our secular culture.
There's a tendency to just think, well, a hero is somebody who's done something I really like that I think maybe I would want to do if I were in that situation. Sometimes hero is more just, wow, this is somebody who's just really good at what he does, particularly if not so much today, but in earlier ages, great warrior, regardless of whether he was a good person or not, would just be, well, he's a hero. But, there's really should be a lot more nuance to it. Because if we're really going to be talking about heroes in the sense of these are people that we look up to, these are good examples for us, we need to define the term, or at least understand it in such a way that we're not holding up things or people that shouldn't be held up for us, and that we're looking to the right things to say, well, this is good, and this is something that should be an example or an encouragement for me.
So why are people drawn to heroes? What is it about them that makes them important, or why do we kind of feel like we maybe even need heroes?
One of the main things is that not everybody does the right thing. And certainly not everybody has the courage to do the right thing when it involves risk to them. So we need people who have the guts to do the right things at the right times and for the right reasons, even when there is risk involved. And I think that aspect of risk is really kind of a key thing when we're talking about being a hero. Doing the right thing just doesn't cost you anything. Well, that's great that you did the right thing, but we don't really see anything particularly heroic in that. And so, in the first sense, we need them because they do things that other people aren't willing to do. But in a secondary sense, we need them for examples. We need them for encouragements, things that we ourselves can look to, and particularly, I think, things that we can point our children to, successive generations, and say, this is what the good person looks like. This is what it means to have, hold on to something and be willing to pay the price for it.
One of the things I did in prepping for today's podcast was I went into the NIV and I said, show me every place in the Bible that uses the word hero. And it doesn't show up at all in the New Testament. It's only in the Old Testament. And it's only in 7 verses. And in, I believe, 6 of the 7 or 5 of the 7, it uses the same word. And in all of those instances, the word that's used is tied closely to the word strength. In other words, they were known for being strong, courageous, and quite honestly, I like the King James translation of being renowned. In other words, they were known for this. Like, for example, the first use of the word is with the Nephilim in the Old Testament, and they were called heroes. And the King James Version says that they were actually people, they were known for being strong, known for being mighty, those kinds of things.
And these were people too, right? Pre-Noah, right?
Yep. And then it also is used after the flood to describe some different people who are known for being, like, for example, Goliath. When they found out their hero was dead, is what the passage says. And the fellow was dead. But really, hero, I just think is a poor translation in the Old Testament, because it's also the word hero is used to describe King David in one of the Psalms. The interesting thing is I thought, well, first of all, what's the Hebrew word? It's not the same Hebrew word as translated as Hebrew for Nephilim or for Goliath. But also what was interesting is that the King James Version basically said he was something on the order of the sweetest of the psalmists. In other words, when you looked at the etymology of the Hebrew word used, and it really was kind of an accentuation of all that is. So, for example, for the Nephilim and for Goliath, it was emphasis of them being strong, mighty, the champion who was going to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
In the example of David, it was just the melodic, he wrote the most beautiful psalms, and that's how the word is used. Then when you slip over into the New Testament, it's never used. What's the predominant word in the New Testament, and it's the word that Jeff just touched on, and that is example. And I think that when we want to think of the word hero as Christians, first of all, remember context. The world's context of a hero is someone who's making the world a better place. But when we talk about heroes of faith and so forth, we're talking about people who exemplify. And perhaps, the best example is where we're told in Scripture, Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps, which has always been like the marching orders for me in trying to show kindness and sacrificial consideration for others.
I think one of the key aspects of things, and this is, actually touches on something that Bob put me onto a few years ago about the difference between principles and applications. And heroes understand and hold to principles, and they're able to distinguish them from applications, even while they make brave and perhaps costly applications of those principles. And this is part of what distinguishes a hero from everybody else. Talk about Christian martyrs. A true Christian martyr recognizes that the principle is that you always remain faithful to Christ no matter what. And the application of that principle might mean that you're going to put your life at risk because you're going to stay faithful, and somebody's threatened you if you do that, and you may lose your life as a result of that. But a false martyr, and there were lots of these throughout the history of the Christian church, particularly when you got into about the fourth or fifth centuries and so, false martyr latches onto the application and seeks or even incites persecution and possible death. It's like, well, this is what a martyr does, die for their faith. And they claim it's all for Jesus, but at the best, they're confused. At worst, they're just doing it for their own reasons. They've lost sight of that principle, which is staying true to Christ, and confused it there. Another example would be in wartime. The wartime hero recognizes that the principle is to fight as effectively as possible to protect the people important to him and to achieve whatever objective is there. The application of that principle is being that he's may put his entire life at risk in order to do this. The coward looks at the application and says, I want nothing to do with that. and rejects the principle behind it. And so I think we can apply this to all sorts of different things. And that's why the principle of, or the idea of an example works in there so much, because what makes this person an example? This is somebody who's got this pure sense of the principle behind it and is not only willing to do the right thing, is willing to do the right thing no matter what it costs.
One of the challenges when I looked at this topic is the first question I started asking myself is, okay, Bob, who are your heroes?
Yeah.
And, other than Gordon Lightfoot, no, I'm sorry. Nobody appreciates my taste in music. Never understood this. But the reality was I realized I had no heroes in the way the world understands heroes. I have people who are just incredible examples of faith that I not only it's probably a combination of envy and aspire. When I was listening to Jeff talk about the people who are doing things that you can't do, I mean, I have a whole long list of people like that people who are people say, well, I could never be a missionary in Africa. I could never do that. And I'm thinking, shoot, I couldn't be a missionary in southern United States. They got snakes down there, and there are just different things that people do that you can't do. And I admire that. I genuinely admire that. Somebody had asked me once, what would your autobiography look like? And I said, well, my autobiography would actually be multiple chapters, and every chapter devoted to a person that has touched me in life, for good or bad. I mean, not every contact in life was a positive experience, but the point is that there's a ton of chapters that would be devoted to people who were incredible examples. You too. I mean, in many ways, both of you demonstrate characteristics that I long for, and I'm trying to learn them, and I keep studying. And I think, the problem is I was very interested during the time that Mother Teresa lived, and then the reaction when Mother Teresa died, and then the reaction when her book came out. Because when her book came out, it crushed a lot of people because she expressed doubts about her faith. She, the Bible passage that says, yes, Lord, I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief. How many times haven't we said, hey, that describes me? It is kind of like, why do we identify so well with Peter and Paul? When Paul says the good that I would do, that I do not, the evil I would not do, that I keep on doing. And we're going, hey, that's me. Or Peter, stepping out of the boat, God, I'll walk on water for you. And then all of a sudden you start looking at the waves, you start sinking. Mm-hmm. That's me. We see ourselves so often in that. And so when Mother Teresa, who for some odd reason, they all thought she was this almost like perfect personification of a saint in life, demonstrated she was the perfect personification of every other human being. There were times of great faith, and great sacrifice, great kindness, worth imitating by all of us. And there were times where she was incredibly human. And she showed that. And I think when we begin to see that in our heroes, in our examples, I think we begin to get the flavor of what Scripture talks about.
I think that's true, too, because I also was thinking about my heroes as well. And I could think of heroes that I had for a short period of time, but then it changed a little bit. And so I was on this too, like, okay, well, why did it change? Some of it was realizing that these people that I had looked up to or thought of as heroes were not perfect, right? Because heroes tend to show their flaws at some point too. And even just then thinking about like comic book heroes, I mean, Superman had his kryptonite. I mean, there were weaknesses with heroes, and I guess that makes for good movies and stuff too. But just this idea that our heroes, that there are holes in that, and even with biblical heroes too, like what you were saying just about Peter and Paul too, and how and in some ways you look up to those people because they do have weaknesses like you have as well.
I also was asking, okay, who have been my heroes? And I just realized it's easier, at least if you're thinking of the big characters of, things and not just, the people in your own life.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot easier to find them in history than in current events because it's a fixed quantity there, and you don't have to worry about, well, if I call him a hero today, what's he going to do tomorrow? And so I was thinking, okay, set aside all the people in the Bible, for now, because that's a given. We can say that. I can look theologically and religiously to people like Martin Luther and Martin Chemnitz, people who stood on their principles, and particularly Luther's great "Here I stand, I can do no other" speech. But then there are figures like William Wilberforce out of history. A British politician, was really in many ways the key man in making sure that Britain outlawed the slave trade, which had been a huge moneymaker for Britain. And just an amazing story, a strong Christian, and that informed and inspired everything he did. And it's just the kind of person you say, well, I would like to be like that. If I were a politician, that's the kind of man I would look up to. And then there are people like Abraham Lincoln. And he's always been a bit of a personal hero to me. I feel a bit more of a connection with him. But what you learn about him, he had flaws. He considered himself a Christian, but he wasn't much of a churchgoer. He knew his Bible. He quoted the Bible. The thing I was talking about, principles. He understood the principle. People shouldn't be enslaved. And he was willing to do things in order to see that come true, even when it wasn't politically advantageous to him. He was able to do that, and he achieved a whole lot, and he paid the price for it. I'm sure his wife would have preferred he hadn't been quite so out front with so many things there. And there's so many people like that if you look for them. And I have to admit, there was somebody else I was thinking of as, these really good example of humble heroes. Frodo and Sam from The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Yep.
It's just like, that's heroism for you. They know what they have to do. They do it no matter the cost, and without losing who they are in the process.
What's up, guys? Steve here with the Balance of Gray podcast. Do you ever feel like sermons skip the chapters you're living in?
What?
Like church turned into a TED Talk after a concert? Well, at the Balance of Gray, we ask real questions, wrestle with real doubts, and we leave room for some laughs along the way.
Ooh.
But make no mistake, prophecies are unfolding, and this isn't dress rehearsal. It's the final act. The gospel isn't a vibe, it's a rescue plan. And lukewarm doesn't cut it. From scientific proof to spiritual warfare, this is where faith is not blind. Search The Balance of Gray wherever you get your podcasts and hit follow now. That's The Balance of Gray podcast. I'll see you soon.
Phenomenon is what it is.
Now, I'm going to give you some real practical examples of what you guys are talking about with heroes who are flawed. One of the things, and it made me think of it when Jeff was talking about history is an easy place. I think pretty much everybody knows that I'm a big history buff, do a lot of reading on history, and I'm always shattered. Sometimes I'll pick up a book on history and I'm all eager to read it, and all of a sudden you read all these other stories you weren't aware that came up. Well, in pro-life work, we look for heroes who stand on principle. And I'll give you a very practical example. In the early 90s, Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who was very involved in the pro-abortion movement, late 60s, early 70s, ran an abortion clinic, and then he became a pro-life convert, which, of course, becomes a hero. That's how you become a hero. I mean, he just saw the error of his ways, basically publicly disavowed his allegiances, and he came out with 2 videos in which he had showed what happens in an abortion. They were horrible videos to watch and everything. Noteworthy was in the second video, it was narrated by none other than Charlton Heston, who played Moses and the voice of God in the 10 Commandments, and just really big deal. So in 1995, we're getting ready for our national convention. So we decide we're going to get Charlton Heston. So I had to work with some donors on it and worked with Heston's office. Long and short of it is, Charlton Heston was our main speaker for a convention we were holding in Michigan. It was the first time we ever had a high-profile speaker of that caliber. We sold out the number of people we could have at the convention. Everything was going great. So it's like a week before the convention, and one of the staff people said, well, Heston's biography just came out, autobiography. And in it, he swears. It's like, what? And he's retelling stories from the Cecil B. DeMille film of 10 Commandments, and it involved horrible language and things. And then it was revealed that he also sent money on occasion to support Planned Parenthood. And this is our main speaker. So then he's not only our main speaker. So, we kind of sit in staff meeting. We're going, well, maybe nobody will read the book yet before the convention. So we get to the convention. So what does he do? First of all, when he comes, he's an elderly man. So he is not Moses from the 10 Commandments anymore. And I still remember him shuffling out, and one of our staff people made a joke about, I have kind of a high-pitched voice, and so, he always had, here I am, hi, everybody, here's, Charlton Heston, and then, of course, the voice of God. Heston comes out, he's crouched over a little bit, he actually gets behind the podium, stands straight up, and just that voice, booming voice. But what does he do in the course of his speech, which was a pre-written speech he probably gave 100 times? He swore a couple of times in the speech at the audience of Christian Life Resources. And of course, then the letters would come and everything. But it does raise the question, we admired him for the work he had done on the narration of that second video, but I couldn't control all the other things he had done. I wish he hadn't sworn. I wish he hadn't given money to an organization like Planned Parenthood. But it was just the reality. And there are other stories of speakers in our past, some of whom were wells. You admired them, you had them speak, and then something happens in the past and comes up in their life, and all of our heroes were tarnished. I would have liked to have the Apostle Peter speak at one of our conventions, but I don't know how I would have explained how you could be looking straight at Jesus and you're sinking in the lake. How simple that should have been. I think there's a lesson of caution, not only in how we adopt an example, but caution in how critical we want to be of people who choose examples. I admire Charlton Heston for being in a very liberal environment and being willing to stand for pro-life. Okay, that didn't mean everything he had done was right. And the same thing, too, there are people who are going to admire any one of the three of us for what we have done, but we hope they don't look at everything. The psalmist said, don't hold the sins of my youth against me. Mm-hmm. Prior to recording, Chris and I were talking about next week. I'm having a high school friend come around, and we're going to do it. I got a feeling he's going to remember a couple of things that I hope nobody else remembers. It's things like that, and that's because we're dealing with flawed people. And that's why if you only want one reliable example, it'll be Jesus.
Right. I think, what Bob has really touched on, too, is this idea of what happens when our heroes fail us and we see their flaws or we see them fall a little bit, too.
When that happens, I think a first question we want to ask ourselves is, was it right to be holding this person up as a hero in the first place? Maybe some sports star or something like that. It's like, wow, this guy is great. And like, was he really? But, maybe I was just impressed by something, but maybe what I thought was good wasn't actually. But even when you get beyond that, it's the point that's been made. Just we recognize that our heroes are human, just as we are. They may be better. They may actually be holier than we are. They may not be. It may simply be that God has placed them into this particular situation at this particular time to do this particular thing, and they are heroic in the way that they do that. But the rest of their life, it may be a mess. Look at David, called a hero in the Bible, did many heroic things, and yet look at the whole thing with Bathsheba and Uriah. Definitely had his flaws there. And we can look at Abraham, and we can look at all the disciples and so many others in Scripture and see the same thing. So one thing we remember is that weaknesses, even one-time failures, don't necessarily undo anything about that person's heroism. They certainly don't destroy the principles that gave birth to that heroism either.
When I was thinking about biblical heroes too, and kind of like just how Bob was saying too, with people like Peter, and you see people that struggled but then rose above it, and so it's like you see their flaws but then maybe they rise above it. But one that I have been just thinking about recently is Rahab, and how just her past and just the things that maybe must have been going through her mind, or, was she helping the spies because she just really didn't have hope anymore, or did she really believe too? And then but you can see the growth in that. And when you can rise above your circumstances too, just gives such motivation, I think, for other people too.
We have a problem in our society today where people are flipping it. They are taking the flaws of people and they are elevating those as things that are heroic. I think, for example, when Bruce Jenner decided that he was going to be Caitlyn, all sorts of people came out and talked about how heroic that was, and all sorts of similar things with people coming out as homosexuals and things like that. Oh, this was such a hero. And no, it's not, because what they're doing isn't good. It's self-centered, not others-centered. The only principle there is do what's right by you. People will like the example of that because that encourages them to do what's right by them. But as Christians, we can't hold out as heroes people who are only really serving their own desires and that are obviously doing things that are contrary to God's will.
This morning in my morning readings, I was looking at the list of the people who were going to be given the Medal of Honor today in a White House proceeding. And the names that you hear in the media, probably the most often, is like Liz Cheney. So that's always coming up. And of course, the media is getting behind it because she was Republican. This is, the Democratic president going to give her the Medal of Honor for the January 6th hearings and so forth. And quite honestly, that's neither here nor there for me. That's politics and stuff. So I'm going down the list and I run across Eleanor Smeal. And I'm going, that name I know. I remember it back a number of years ago, but she was head of the National Organization of Women. She was a big, major advocate in abortion rights and so forth. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, so this is what the president of our nation is going to give the Medal of Honor, which is kind of like civilian heroes. That's really what it is. And of course, the millions of thoughts that run through my mind, I'm looking at that and I'm going, when you're living for heaven on earth, when you're living for this is the way I want everything to be, maybe that's it. In their vision of heaven on earth, women should be able to kill their offspring. Then these kinds of people get the alarms. They get the accolades. And I think we have to remember why people have the different heroes. And I think to myself, what makes a sports hero? Well, we've had a past speaker at one of our CLR conferences, conventions, was Bart Starr. Why was Bart Starr here? Quite honestly, Bart Starr always was a personal sports hero of mine. And the reason I liked Bart Starr, quite honestly, was Rawhide Boys Ranch, which is just, it's not called Rawhide Boys Ranch anymore because it's a co-ed now, but Rawhide had this unique Christian-based ministry of taking boys who were criminals, caught up in the criminal system, and they boasted an 86% rate of them never going back into crime, which is the secular rate was like 12% or some ridiculously low average. And Rawhide was my template for when I started New Beginnings, the Home for Mothers. And so I thought, well, if Bart Starr was behind it, I'd like to get kind of behind it. Well, then on top of that, Bart and Cherry Starr lost a son from drug overdose. And I've always been concerned about substance abuse and fighting that. So, he just became a logical one to do it. And I figured, I didn't know where he was on abortion and positions like that, but I figured, if he doesn't like our position, he'll just say no when we ask him. And instead he said yes. So I was all excited. But then again, like Charlton Heston, his speech was probably the same speech he gave last night at the JC's meeting and the night before at the Knights of Columbus and the nights before, just like that. So we tend to, even with sports stars, we got to ask ourselves, why do we pick them? I don't know how you guys are now, but when I'm watching these, I'm looking at character. That becomes, a sports hero who's just incredible at their sport isn't enough for me anymore. I'm looking for character. And then, of course, you take a risk because, again, characters in an imperfect world mean there's going to be character flaws. Mm-hmm. But I do look at character and I admire character. I look at, the kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. Strong Christian, stands for traditional family, which of course is not popular nowadays. And when they interviewed the quarterback, Mahomes, for how do you feel about that? Mahomes said, I don't agree with all of his positions, but I admire him. Well, if I were the quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs, I admire him for kicking field goals and stuff, getting the ball where it's supposed to go, and so you got to remember that you're dealing in some pretty rocky territory.
Well, as we kind of bring it together then to when we were thinking then of pro-life, and who can our pro-life heroes be and how can we identify them in the context of marriage and family too?
Oh, I think Bob alluded to this earlier that some we do not call heroes are the people who blow up abortion clinics and kill abortionists. In addition to everything that they're doing being immoral, ungodly, and unwise, they're also focusing on the application and losing sight of the principle, where the principle is no human is supposed to kill another human. And somehow they've lost sight of that. But, I think rather than looking to, there's this person in the pro-life movement and, it's a leader there, and that's the one we should look to as a hero. I think it's more, what about the mothers in very difficult circumstances who, when everyone around them and the culture is saying, you should get an abortion, say, no, I'm going to have my child. Regardless of the circumstances, this is a life that God has given me to take care of, and I'm going to. That's, in my mind, heroic. We can think of doctors and other medical professionals who take their stand for life when the insurance companies or the hospitals or their fellow doctors or even their patients are pushing them to do things that are not properly respectful of God's gift of life. They say no. No matter what it cost me professionally or financially or whatever, I'm going to do the right thing. And they're willing to stand up for that. And I think those are people, that we can call heroes. And the rare politician who is consistently pro-life, who remains that, works to advance the cause of life, even when the political winds are blowing the opposite direction. We're going to need more and more of those these days because it seems that political winds are blowing the wrong direction a lot.
What Jeff's describing really are people of unique character who are willing to sacrifice something bigger, something better maybe that the world offers, and sacrifices that in favor of a higher principle of thinking more of others and of themselves. When I was thinking of this part of this, I thought, well, I can't invoke any names of people who are living because that's awkward, And there's one fellow who died a number of years ago already, Tom Marzan. Tom Marzan was an attorney who served on some presidential committees and stuff like that, but very pro-life. And I think Tom could have made much more money in his field. But what made Tom unique is Tom was one of those people that any of us could have called. He never lost himself in the part. He had this high position. He was very admired on pretty much all sides of an issue, but very sacrificially just said, I am going to stand for what's right. And I always remember he had this kind of plain down to earth way of talking about things. He didn't get lost in the verbiage of scholarly, brilliance as he had. And those are the kinds of people that I admire. So like Jeff says, when we have mothers who say, I am not going to take the life of my child, even though it would be an advantage for me by worldly standards, I'm not going to do it. Why? Because there is something higher that I stand for. And the same with people who say, I could make a lot more money doing all sorts of other things, being involved in other industries, but there's something a lot higher. Those are heroes, and a lot of times you just have to be content with admiring heroes who are other people aren't going to share your appreciation for.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for this discussion today. Really, I was just sitting here nodding a lot because I really enjoyed it. And it just really gave me a lot to think about too in the context of heroes. And so we hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. And if you have any questions on this topic or any others, you can reach us at lifechallenges.us. And we look forward to having you back next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. Please consider subscribing to this podcast, giving us a review wherever you access it, and sharing it with friends. We're sure you have questions on today's topic or other life issues. Our goal is to help you through these tough topics, and we want you to know we're here to help. You can submit your questions as well as comments or suggestions for future episodes at lifechallenges.us or email us at podcast@christianliferesources.com. In addition to the podcasts, we include other valuable information at lifechallenges.us, so be sure to check it out. For more about our parent organization, please visit christianliferesources.com. May God give you wisdom, love, strength, and peace in Christ for every life challenge.